at the methods of data collection and generation through fieldwork. I will not be delving deep into any of these except for observation, because the intention for this lecture is to focus on one of these methods of collecting and generating data, and I am looking at the method of observation. So we all understand that fieldwork entails careful observation. And when I say observation, I mean that it is very different from simply seeing. Observation is always with some intent, at least in the context of fieldwork. So fieldwork entails careful observation, measurements and recording of information in the field using a wide variety of methods, which include observation, transect walk, interview, focus group discussions, and visual media, including photographs, video films, etc. One must also understand that the scale of inquiry in terms of the spatial and temporal aspects determines the nature of fieldwork and therefore the choice of methods of data collection. So what is important right at the outset is issues regarding logistics. Now here I'm not going back to the issues of research questions and the objectives of your research. That has been already talked about. But we are now looking at the nature of fieldwork, which will determine the choice of methods for collecting and generating data. So one of the issues is with the logistics, which essentially implies site selection alongside the availability of time and resources. Now resources both in terms of finances as well as manpower. On the other side is the question of theoretical issues. How are the data going to be analyzed and interpreted? And how those conclusions from analysis is going to be drawn? This also determines the choice of methods. So this is contingent upon three things. The first is space. So when we say space, we are essentially talking about different sites which are surveyed to help us establish distinct patterns of the phenomena being studied. The second is time. So we study phenomenon over a period of time in order to identify change. And the third is place, which essentially implies one or more spaces or sites which can be studied as a case study for more intensive investigations. So place is a subset of space. So broader patterns will emerge when we are looking at different sites and trying to establish some sort of commonality of the phenomenon under investigation. Whereas when we are looking at place, from within that sites, we identify one or two which will be studied very intensively. So what is the most appropriate method for employing in the fieldwork? Like I had said before, the most appropriate methods would depend on the research question and the information that is being sought. So the question of space, time, and place, they all determine our research question as well. And each of these methods, observation, transect walk, interview, FGD, and visual media, all of them have their own particular strengths and weaknesses. But it is best to utilize multiple methods which is a process known as triangulation. And by triangulation, we use different sources to provide different perspectives and help maximize our understanding of the research questions. By triangulation, we don't mean we are repeating the generation of data in the same way by using one particular method. If the intention of triangulation is repetition, then there is no point in using different methods. Essentially, triangulation is employed so that we get a variety of data, and each of these would have its own perspective, which will help to maximize our understanding of our research questions. And from these methods will emerge certain types of data, which will be analyzed and interpreted. So it is important to collect data and generate data using multiple methods. What can be achieved in observation cannot be achieved through interview. Interview is much more resource intensive, particularly when you're looking at interviewing a large sample. You would necessarily require also a lot many hands to generate those data through the interview method. Observation, on the other hand, would help us to generate data which does not involve direct communication with our participants. We can observe phenomenon on our own and take notings, and likewise we would be able to generate a rich data about the place or about the phenomenon by simply observing. Similarly, focus group discussions would be necessitated if we are trying to look at the community's view on a certain regarding a certain context, regarding a certain issue. So interview would be more individual based, whereas focus group discussion would be based on several participants together at one place. On the other hand, visual media, which is produced, whether it is self-produced, very good. But if it is not self-produced, but produced by someone else, and you're analyzing that, that also is not intrusive. Okay. So in that sense, each of these methods will generate a certain type of data, and each will have its own advantages as well as disadvantages. And one needs to use the triangulation method, make use of 3 methods at least, to generate some sort of data which are rich in content and will also help you to therefore maximize your understanding of the research problem. It is equally possible that one can do research within the confines of the library or your home or office, often which is referred to as the desktop research, without even stepping into the field. So a research which is based on visual imagery, particularly on films or television programs, or a content analysis based on films and television programs, will not require the researcher to step out in the field. Likewise, archival material or contemporary historical material would be useful for undertaking secondary database research. Similarly, maps and remotely sensed data could also be used. And in fact, over the past 1+ year, due to the current pandemic, researchers are relying a lot on online surveys and conducting interviews conducting discussions over different platforms. In fact, had it not been for the pandemic, you all and I would have been interacting in Ramanujan College campus as part of this refresher course. So there is every possibility of doing research without having to step out into the field. Sorry. Okay. Now let us progress towards the observation as a method of data collection and generation. This is very, very important method of both data collection and generation in social sciences. So it's a critical part of fieldwork and interpretation of landscape. So if you're trying to understand the landscape, observation is one method to capture the differences in landscape. Early on in this lecture, I had talked about travel to a hill station, or perhaps even traveling to a coastal location, any such location which is different from your current location. The first thing that you notice about the natural phenomenon or the landscape variations, they are all captured through the method of observation. We observe how the landscape is different in our city and how it is different in another city. How settlements in Rajasthan are very different from the settlements in Konkan area or any of the coastal locations. So observation is the act of visualizing. And as a researcher, you need to have an eye for detail. Observation enables measurement of phenomenon, and it helps us to capture those matters which may otherwise escape our notice. Say, for example, the participants here are all faculty members. All of you have very rich experience, vast experience of teaching. When you come into the class, the first thing that you do is observe the students. Isn't that the case? Even while you are teaching, your attention is also on how students are responding to what is being taught by you. Now, what is a faculty that you are employing to capture this sentiment of your students? You may observe that some students are very enthusiastic. They may be responding to you very quickly, but there could be one or two students who may not be responding enthusiastically, or they may be distracted. So as a teacher, you're able to capture the difference amongst these set of students by the simple process of observation. So in social sciences, observation has been a traditionally valued attribute, and it has enjoyed primacy amongst the methods of fieldwork, particularly in the discipline of geography. Observation requires detailed work, and at the same time, it is also a tedious process. It's only when you have observed well that you are able to describe the people, the settings, activities, non-verbal communications, etc., and also talk about the context in which these events happen. So, observation method helps researchers to gather first-hand information and at the same time enable the researcher to understand the context of these observations as well as at the same time, the researcher would be able to capture what is also a miss. This particularly is a context in which I was giving the example of teachers being observant about the behavior of their students. In addition, those matters which are deliberately left out or which escape the purview of research through other methods of data collection, such as interviews, can be easily captured through observation. For example, in an interview, the respondent may decline to answer a question. Well, the respondent is well within his or her rights to decline to respond to a specific question. But as a researcher who is trained in observing, you will employ this faculty of trying to gather some specific points about that respondent's behavior as to why the respondent declined to respond to the question asked. Perhaps the respondent felt uncomfortable. If that be the case, the researcher would quickly note, would observe and quickly note the discomfort experienced by the respondent through his body language or the hesitancy on part of the respondent. So all of these nuances are captured through observation. So in that sense, observation as a method enables a researcher to go beyond the stated ideas or perceptions created of others. There are three-step process of observation. One is descriptive observation, which is observing each and every aspect of the situation and the site or the phenomenon under study. The second is focused observation. A trained researcher would be able to separate the relevant from the irrelevant. And focused observations come in handy mostly through the interview method and well-defined types of group activities. I've just now given you the example of a respondent unwilling to give an answer to a question raised by the researcher. And the third is selective observation, concentrating only on one or a few prominent elements which are of interest to the researcher. So the researcher will have a specific role as part of an observer. When the researcher is gathering or generating data, the researcher may choose to be a complete participant observer, or the researcher can choose to be an observer as an onlooker or outsider. So on one hand, there is complete immersion of the researcher in the event. So the researcher becomes a participant, whereas on the other hand, the researcher may remain as a mere onlooker to this event which the researcher is investigating, and maintain objectivity and neutrality. And this is possible because the researcher has not embedded himself or herself in the setting. So there are variations in the level of involvement of the researcher while taking observations. But please remember that the extent of researcher-observer participation again is a continuum, as it varies between complete immersion, observer as a participant, to complete separation of the observer who simply watches the setting as an outsider. While in participant observation, the researcher shares life and activities of the area under study or the community under study in order to develop the insider's view, which is also known as going native. So such observations are known as overt observations. However, a point of concern regarding such overt observations are that the participants may behave differently in a setting where they are being observed by the researcher. So there would be hesitancy. The participants may not be behaving naturally, whereas the intention or the objective of the observation may actually be to study the natural or the actual responses of the participants. On the other hand, when you're looking at the least involvement of the researcher in the setting, in such a situation, the researcher makes covert observations simply as an outsider. So in this sense, the researcher would be able to capture the real behavior and response of the participants since they are unaware of being observed by the researcher. The choice between overt and covert observations is dependent on the researcher's search for truth and depth of understanding the issues. So the choice has to be made by the researcher at the outset. The second approach to observation is, what is the focus of the observations? Is the researcher focusing on a single phenomenon or an element? Or is the researcher focusing on several elements or phenomenon? So when it is a narrow focus, such observations are very intensive. Whereas when several elements are being observed, the observations will be extensive. They'll be more holistic of the phenomenon under study. The third aspect of observation is the duration of observation, which could be single point observation, which is of limited duration, or it could be multiple observations carried out over a long period of time. So again, these are guided by the research questions as well as the researcher's search for truth and depth, which the researcher wishes to achieve through his or her research. Now, the current approach of researcher is one of situational identities, which means creating situational identities by seeking active involvement or membership roles in communities and community affairs. And in that sense, the research agenda would therefore be determined by the community as opposed to the traditional observation approach, in which case the agenda is led by the researcher's objectives, researcher's questions. So in the context of situational identities, power is ceded to the community rather than it remaining with the researcher. So in that sense, the researchers empowering communities to direct the research rather than being mere subject of the researcher's goal. So there is also the possibility, therefore, that the researcher would at some times employ blended identities, which means at some point the researcher is looking at his or her role as a researcher, the primacy of the researcher, but in many other contexts, the researcher would be giving primacy to the community. All said and done, observation as a tool of fieldwork should be done in a manner to capture the required data, which helps answer the research questions and achieve the purpose of research.